My name is Sam Temple, and this is Susan Anderson, and we are part of the Ars Poetica class, and it has been our privilege to be announcing and introducing the readers as we go along. And tonight, we have the privilege of introducing Peter Rock, who will be reading from his new novel, Spells. Spells is described as a novel within photographs. It's a collaborative piece with 43 different photographs and 31 different stories. One of the stories, Elephants, is written from the perspective of a 4-year-old. Born and raised in Salt Lake City, Peter Rock is the author of many novels, including The Shelter Cycle, The Bewildered, Carnival Wolves, and Click-a-Tat. Rock's stories and writing have appeared and been anthologized widely and has been published in various countries and languages. He is the recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, and Alex Award, among others. He currently lives in Portland, where he's a professor of English at Reed College. And in one interview, he said that he's learned to write well, especially I've learned that to write well, I really do have to get bewildered, deeply confused, and have no idea where I am, who I am, or what is going on, and I think that's something that many of us can relate to. I'd like to introduce Peter Rock.
Thank you so much again. Yes. Yes. Okay, I can work it out. Thank you all so much for coming and for inviting me. I'm going to read from this project, Spells, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it between sections that I read to sort of explain where it came from, what my thinking was, how it operated, and I'll be changing the pictures around to distract you from looking at me. You might not get the sense when you listen to the things I read tonight that it all fits together, but there is a narrative, but it's also a story that deals with different kinds of dreams. It's a story where people who die often return and look quite a bit different than they did before. And so I'm going to jump around a little bit, but I'm going to start at the beginning. This is the first piece. It's called To Begin is to Start. An idea is not a thing you have. It cannot be possessed like that, like an envelope or a letter. A risk is a thing you take, and a decision is a thing you make. A decision is not so fragile, not so tenuous as a promise, though both are things you make, beginnings. Sometimes the invitation comes from another person or another animal, a bear or dog or ghost. Sometimes it comes from oneself. It does not matter if an invitation comes from without or arises from within. Be still, yet ready to strike, poised and taut. A snake has more than 200 teeth, pointed backward to zip you up, to bite and hold you securely. Security is always a misapprehension. You can slip away. You could take a risk. Be decisive. Power ceases in the instant of repose, and the inside of you never stops, your heart circling your blood around and around right now, 2,000 gallons in your lifetime. Wind blows in and out of you across the deserts and mountains. It slams doors in the middle of the night, wakes you with a start. So one simple way to talk about this book is I collected a number of images from 5 different photographers, and one of the main rules was I couldn't have any context. I didn't know the photographers. I didn't want to know anything about them. They promised me not to tell them where the pictures were taken or who were the people in the pictures or anything like that. And I think this is pretty typical of how we react to images when we don't have context. We look in and we wonder, what's happening? Who are those people? What's the story here? So that's the basic thing that I was doing while I was writing these stories. As I was saying earlier today, I've learned in terms of finding inspiration, just trusting my curiosity, but also putting myself in a context or surrounded by things that intrigue me and that are confusing and that provoke something out of me that I didn't know was in there, that surprised me, is something I've been trying hard to do. So being startled by these photographs was the start of what I was doing. I'm just sharing some of these pictures that I'm not going to read the stories of, and then I'm going to cheat a little bit with the next one, and I'm going to switch images a few times, and you'll know when it's the one image that belongs to this story. Some of the stories have more than one, but this story has 4 parts, so I'm just going to use some pictures from other parts of the book. And the name of the story is 4 Chambers Has the Human Heart. Once there was a girl who couldn't sleep. Late at night, she pulled the skins from her bed, stepped over her sleeping sister, and left her hut. The sky was cold and black, punctured by stars. As the girl walked, she felt a knocking, as if someone was tapping on the soles of her feet from underneath the ground. She bent down and pressed her ear to the short, frozen grass. What she heard was a slow beating, perhaps a distant train. She held her breath. It had to be her heart, she decided, her own heart. Standing, she walked again. There were no trees in the night, nothing growing in any direction. Behind her, she could no longer see the fires of her village. She listened, she got down on her knees and pressed her ear to the ground once again. The heartbeat, she realized, was not her own. She decided to walk in the direction where it grew stronger. After a time, the girl was crossing a windswept plain. She approached a pile of rocks, round stones the size of a man's head. And as she began to walk around these rocks, a voice suddenly called out to her. "Girl, stop for a moment. Talk to me. Listen." The stones were dark gray, the space between them quite black. The girl leaned close then and finally found a space where she could see a man's mouth. He seemed to be lying on his side, buried beneath all the heavy stones. "Hello there," she said. "Is that your heart I'm hearing?" "I would like to tell you a story," he said. "You want me to help you get out?" she said. "This is where I belong," he said. "I don't want you to get me out." His lips, framed by the sharp stones, were cracked and dark, his teeth chipped and jagged. "Was it that you couldn't sleep?" he said. "Is that how you found me?" "I'm out walking," she said. "In my village, everyone is asleep." "Are you lonely?" he said. The cold wind blew across the plain, whistled on all the edges of the stones. "Are you a dead person?" she said. The man in the pile of stones was silent for a moment, and then he spoke again. "I found my wife in the garden," he said, "where she'd been picking beans, leaning over the plants. A snake leapt up and bit her in the neck. When I found her, her fingers were still tight around that snake, just below his head. Both of them were dead, and on the ground was a half-full metal bowl of beans." "Is that an answer to my question?" the girl said. "If a person isn't lonely," he said, "would that person miss being lonely?" "Is this a riddle?" she said. "Have you ever felt that your rib cage had been scraped clean?" he said. "I don't think so," she said. "No, I have not." The hope in this situation is that the right letters can be put together. Letters fit together can become a word, which can become a key that can unlock the lock on the heavy black metal door. When the door is unlocked, when you step inside, a wind blows the door shut. The wind, it is a thick kind of wind. It holds you where you are, and it buffets you, pulls at your clothing. The roots of your hair begin to sting. The chamber is so dark, so black, that you can't tell if your eyes are open or closed, and that wind blows so hard that it pulls shadows loose from bodies, slides them away, folds them into the darkness. You have no shadow now. It is somewhere else doing whatever it wants to do. As you stand there, the chamber seems to expand, wind circling, roaring around you, and then the space tightens, the air sucked away, so that it's difficult to breathe, to catch your breath. Your chest is tight, a chamber inside this chamber. It is said that there are 4 chambers, that there are 2 ways in and 2 ways out. But with the wind blowing, you can't go out and indoor or in and outdoor. And in this darkness, it's impossible to guess how the other 3 chambers would ever be found. It's impossible to know if the key you use to access this chamber would also open those doors. The sound of a girl on a bicycle with no brakes, a long slithering all the way down a steep hill as she drags one foot along the pavement. Long ago there was a man who walked across the land carrying a sack that was cinched tight. He never let anyone look inside it. But along came a huge ice bear who was very curious. "What's in your sack?" he asked the man. "Nothing," the man said, "just a big load of shit." "Why are you carrying it around?" "Just in case," the man said, "just in case I need it." This did not satisfy the ice bear, so he began to sing. His voice twisted and smoothed the air, and he sang the man to sleep. Once the man was asleep, the bear opened the sack. Out came the wind. It untangled itself, knocked the ice bear down, and sped away in every direction. It rolled the sleeping man along the ground quite a distance away until he woke up. He angrily went back to where the ice bear stood, holding the empty sack. "O traveler," the bear said, "my cave is just beyond that pile of stones, and my wife is inside. You can have my wife for a full month if you'll only get rid of this wind." "It's too late," the man said, hardly able to stay on his feet. "Not even a full year with your wife would be enough. Wind has entered the world." So the way this project started is the way a lot of projects start for me, which is I was procrastinating, which is what writers do. And I think one way to think about it is, in retrospect, if you make something out of procrastination, it wasn't procrastination. One way I procrastinate is when I'm getting close to the end of a book, I start looking around at images on the web that I think would be good book covers. And then what always happens is I find one and I talk to the photographer, and then I convince the publisher to use it, and then at the last minute they always change it. And they always say, "Oh no, the marketing people don't like it. It's too late to talk about it anymore." So I was looking around for a photograph of a raccoon, and I found one that I really liked, and I contacted the photographer and I told him, "This is what's going to happen." And he said, "That's fine." And then he wrote back and he said, "I'll trade you a print of that photograph for a book." And I said, "That's such a bad deal for you, but I'll do it right away." So I sent him a copy of a book, and he sent me a print of the photograph, but he sent me a number of other photographs also, snapshots. And he sent me a letter that was it was the longest letter since kind of the Mormon Girlfriends of 1985. It's in Salt Lake City. It was handwritten and typed, and it was full of these questions which were ranging from, when did you know this is what you were supposed to do, to when you're working on something and it goes wrong, how do you recognize that and how have you dealt with it in the past? And then other questions like, how did you know your wife was the one for you forever? And can you build a house with your hands? It just went on and on and on. It was insane. But for me, I was enjoying a relatively successful moment in my life, and I thought it would be very healthy for me to spend about 20 minutes a day trying to answer these questions. And so I did. And while I was writing to him, I retold a story of my life, which is that I was a security guard in an art museum for a couple of years. And I spent my time making up stories for all the artwork. And everyone would quit that job because it was so boring, because we weren't allowed to talk to anyone or to sit down or to write anything. It was before phones. It was before cell phones, so it was very strange. And I would try to hold as much as I could in my head, and then there were 6 floors in the museum. There were 6 of us guards, so whoever was on break went up to the 5th floor, and then everyone went down a floor. And I would furtively on the fire stairs write down a whole bunch of words, and then when I was on break, I would write everything I could. And I thought, at that moment in my life, maybe 5 years ago, I thought, that's what I need to do now. That's the kind of project I need to do now. I need to find things that I can work on increments and find things that are so uncommercial that people will be disappointed if they ever surface. And it was not really a plan for them to surface. And I could talk about that later. But I made a list of photographers, and I talked to this photographer, Peter McCullough, who is one of the photographers I worked with. And he made a list, and I contacted people, and I said, I don't know what I'm doing, but if you send me 25 or 30 images, that's one way I can start. And so they did. Some of them sent me more like 100 images, which made it harder. And I thought I would be able to maybe write 5 or 6 pieces from each photographer and see what happened. But part of the nature of the project was I didn't want to know what would happen. I didn't want to have any preconception of what I was doing. And so I recognized that I should just choose one photograph at a time from each photographer. So I kind of worked on 5 at a time. And eventually, I think I wrote about 40 of them, and 31 of them are in the project that's been in the art galleries and that's going to be a book in March. And I guess 43 of the images, but 31 of the stories are in that. And it was sort of amazing when I started getting all the pictures from them. I chose the photographers, but there were so many coincidences that I'll talk about and show you in terms of the kinds of photographs that I got that started to suggest to me where the story might go. It's a story that is really about 3 friends, 2 young women and a young man who live in a town like Portland, who, like all groups of 3 friends, they're attracted to each other in different ways that are confusing and confounding. And one of the young women has been dreamed about by an old man in the story, and he dreams of this girl, and then he sees her on the street, and he starts to follow her. And he gets involved with these 3 friends because of this. And I'll show you some of that in a moment. Go read this short little piece. This is called If a Person is About to Touch You. If a person is about to touch you, you can already feel it. If you're about to meet someone, your body may already know it, a tremor in your organs. If a hand hovers over your bare skin, you can sense its presence. That's the simple, invisible way a hand can convey its intentions, which are, after all, a kind of thinking. Hands have brains and hearts. Every finger does. This can be proved by the delay, the time it takes to understand what our hands have done and why. Hands. They are the vehicles of intuition. When I am beset by emotion, when I think of something, that's when I ask my hands for assistance. And then when my hands suddenly do something, that is the time for me to react. They're out in front of me. They're almost always in front of me, in my field of vision, the part of myself that I know best. When I see my face in a mirror, I am often startled or disappointed. My hands would never surprise me like that. I recognize them reaching out for you. So it's a book that's about the dead and the living. It's about shadows and bodies. It's about cause and effect. It's about being awake and dreaming and trying to sort of confuse or trouble the relationship between those different states. It's been my experience, as I'm sure you all have also experienced, that when you write a story that has something in it that seems not realistic, people always want to know, well, what's really happening, or where's the dreamer, or like what caused this, where's the ground here? And I just wanted, there's a lot of writing about shadows because I really wanted to believe that shadows could come before bodies, or shadows could exist without bodies, and that we wouldn't have to see things in such a causal way. So there are a lot of shadows in the stories that in the photos that I got. There's a huge amount of headlessness and bodies without heads, and also kind of loose heads, which also comes up a lot in the stories. Maybe not in all the ones I'm reading tonight, but you'll see. There's a lot of bears and a lot of dogs. I may come back to this story, but something that was a real challenge when I started writing, and after about 15 stories, I realized they were going to be connected in some way, so there were characters who would continue, but I didn't have photographs of the same people. And so I had to account for, if a character looked really different in a different story, how could I account for that change? And so the old man that I talked about that dreamed of the girl, is a really important character in the story. His name's Oscar. And and the first time we see him, he looks kind of like this. And then a little later, after a series of catastrophes has occurred, he looks a little more like this. And then for the last part of the book, he looks more like this. This story is called Hello. When you see me, then you'll know things are about to become interesting. I am lighthearted, but I don't fool around. Sometimes I greet a visitor by saying, "Hello, I'm dreaming," which is a compliment and then at the same time a kind of fact. I can become like anyone, overcome by tenderness. Help me. Don't be afraid. My eyes were so sharp and then they got better and then turned worse again. I live in hope as I wander in shadows. I wear eyeglasses. I wear a white undershirt for 4 days before I wash it. I wear the shirt frontward, backward, then inside out in both directions. On the 4th day, you can see the tag here beneath my beard, like a little white tongue with writing on it. M. I am a medium-sized man requesting your assistance. If I were to tell you that I'm a dead man with this long gray beard walking around on these bandy-ass legs, would that change anything? An old person telling a story of when they were young, even when it's interesting, it can be very difficult to believe. Or more plainly, such stories are unbelievable to the listener, to the teller. There are stories in my mind that I suspect arrived from somewhere else, not my past. Does it matter? Listen. I have images in my mind I don't recognize. I see people in my photographs who might be me. Can I attach myself to a story, project myself into a picture? Is there a difference if I believe it? I believe everything. I am certain of nothing. I'll be delighted to see you coming. Hello, I'm dreaming. Take, for instance, this photograph here. A man wearing nothing but boots, backward on a spotted horse, lying flat, his dark mustache near the horse's tail. Are they moving? There's snow everywhere, a thicket of trees. That man might be me. Am I being punished or am I playing around? I've always been lighthearted. I've always delighted in the weather. I like to think of myself this adventurer. I'm the kind of person who wouldn't ask for help until the last moment. Listen to me. I'm somewhere between a person like you and the dead person I said I was, or I am dead and still talking. Unbelievable. It frustrates me when you anxious people insist that a story or dream, a ghost or memory must be grounded in a person, a place, a time. Do you honestly believe one must come before the other? Look at me. Things like that can't flow in any one direction. I'm going to go back and read this one. What is known? Are they out to frighten people? What kind of purpose or motivation would that be? Perhaps this is a misunderstanding. Let's begin here. What do we actually know? They're usually white, but they can be invisible, any color. The whiteness is so that they can be seen in the darkness, that's all. That's usually when we're able to see one, or more than one. They aren't always alone. They can travel together. Are they lonely? Do they miss something, someone? They might hold a person inside them, digesting. They might hold a period of time or a place, all different weather. They can, after all, be any shape they choose. Or perhaps they don't choose, but they rarely complain. They don't malinger. Do they haunt places? Do they haunt people? That's such a strong word, thick with connotation. How do they move? You can see for yourself all manner of ways, quick or slow, smooth or stuttering. Sometimes the air is thick and heavy. Other times it's slippery and then nothing can be stopped once it starts moving. I'm just going to read one more story, and then I can take some questions if people have them. This one is called The Daughter and the Dog. There was once a large black dog who was owned by a family with one small daughter. This gentle dog was a companion to the family for many years. His wagging tail slapped the kitchen cabinets. His fierce barking persuaded strangers not to linger. As the dog slept, the small daughter often slept with her head resting on his ribs. She knew well his gentle snoring, his leg twitches, the rise and fall of his body. One day, the family looked out into the yard and saw the dog sleeping in the shadow of a tree. Later in the day, he had still not moved. When the daughter went outside, she saw flies on the dog's coat and the dog not lifting his head to snap at them. The father in the family was a carpenter, and he built the dog a wooden coffin. He dug a square grave in the yard as the daughter stood and watched. A neighbor girl from the village wandered over to see what was happening, then went to look at the dog, who still waited beneath the tree. A wool blanket rested on top of him, and when the girl lifted its edge to see, the daughter told her to go away. The daughter was very young and still learning to speak. She had a few words, but knew how to communicate to make herself understood. As her father moved the dog's stiff body and fitted into the wooden coffin, the daughter refused to let him attach the coffin's lid. He tried to do it as he planned, as you would expect him to, but she would not allow it. In the end, the father had to do as she wished. He did not put the lid on the coffin. He set the dog on his back, all four legs sticking up as the dirt was shoveled in. The daughter in this story is a friend of mine, and that's how I know it's true. The first time she told it to me, I didn't believe her, even though she said she hadn't made it up. And every time over the years, as I got to know her better, every time I asked her, the story came out exactly the same. My friend, the daughter, after the dog was buried, the daughter became quite ill. She had a terrible cough and wouldn't eat. Worst of all, she could no longer speak. It wasn't so much that she lost her voice, she told me, as she had lost her words. In any case, the family tried to keep the daughter in bed, but sometimes they found her in the yard, standing next to her, walking circles around the dog's grave. When they did, they brought her quickly back inside. One day, the daughter leaned down and brushed the loose dirt from the grave with her small, flat hands. Carefully, she uncovered the bottom of the dog's paws. The pads were rough, worn down, yet they were not as cold or stiff as she had expected. The next day, the family was eating breakfast together in the kitchen. Out the window, the father noticed that the grave was disturbed. The dirt scattered, the earth caved in. The dog stood in the yard, shaking dirt from his coat as if it were water, and he'd been swimming, not buried underground. He moved stiffly, so strangely that the family did not approach him right away. He kept blinking his eyes, trying to get the dirt out of them, snapping his jaws, shaking his head. At last the daughter stepped closer to him. She licked her finger and cleared her eyes so that he could see. After he surfaced, the dog no longer responded to his name. In fact, he seemed to be deaf. Also, he had lost his voice and made no sound at all. His knees didn't bend, and he lurched stiffly around the yard. It seemed he would tip over, but he never did. He never lay down. He never ate or drank that anyone saw, nor did he urinate or defecate. He was as unlike a dog as a dog could be. However, the dog's reappearance seemed to heal the daughter. In fact, she began to speak like a much older person, using long words and saying things that the members of her family could not understand. She spoke of sea journeys and lands of ice, animals swimming in the depths far below the surface, all manner of experiences she could never have experienced. Sometimes the daughter stood in the yard for hours, talking and talking, and the dog stood listening, silent and unsteady, his muzzle grayer than anyone could remember. A week after he'd climbed from his grave, the dog died again, found in the same place in the shadows under the tree. He stayed dead the second time, and as soon as he was gone, the daughter lost all her new words. She did not become ill again, only went back to speaking as a young girl, as she had before. It was only much later, when she learned complicated words in school and felt their familiar shapes in her mouth, that she was reminded of her childhood illness. Oh, thank you, thank you.
Is there any chance you might read something even a little weirder?
I'll read one more, but I know people are like, you've been listening to me talk a lot. Weirder. There's one that I thought is not too long that I thought about reading, about these bears. There's a lot of bear stories, and I haven't read one, so that other one was a ghost story. This one's called Friendship. Alex once told Sonia a story about two bears that lived in a far-off land. He couldn't remember where he'd heard it. The story made Sonia cry, even though Alex claimed it was a happy story. When he told it, they were lying in bed, and it was late at night, and neither of them could sleep. The bears were kept in an enclosure outside of a factory, perhaps as an entertainment for the workers, a distraction, though no one could really remember. The workers believed the bears were brothers. The enclosure held old stumps, a trough of water, and a variety of things for the bears to bite and scratch. The bears were not brothers. They were not related at all, and that was not their only secret. They liked each other. They liked the lunch break too, when the workers came out and smoked cigarettes and held sandwiches between the fence's electrical wires. The bears sometimes shocked their noses and leapt back, surprised, with a woof. The workers laughed. The bears shook their heads for a moment, then leaned toward the sandwiches again. One day, the workers no longer appeared. The man who fed the bears also went missing. The bears waited. They grew thin and drank from the muddy puddle. They waited, hoping to be discovered. The bears had been very careful not to let anyone know this fact. One of them could not see. He was blind, and so his friend guided him, grunted and nudged him toward the food, herded him away from the electric fence. This did not change after they'd been abandoned. The bears found grubs beneath the stumps. They barked and growled at the empty gray sky. Once in these lonely days, a giant, great white bear came down out of the mountains. Some would call it a polar bear, some an ice bear, some a ghost bear. This bear walked past the factory, then circled the enclosure. Grunting, he held his head low, then high, trying to understand the situation. The two bears followed him outside the fence, them inside. And then he kept walking away until they couldn't smell him anymore. When the seeing bear slept, he tried to keep the blind bear against him safe. But one morning he woke and his friend was gone. Alarmed and afraid, the seeing bear leapt about onto the highest stump. He growled and called. At last he saw his blind friend beyond the wires of the fence, caught in the corner where two concrete walls met, out at the edge of the parking lot. He growled again, and his distant friend moaned and lifted his head, twisted it around as if he could see. "The fence doesn't hurt anymore," the blind bear called, "and I've found something to eat." These two bears were always cautious, but eventually they realized that all the people were gone from the land. So the seeing bear led the blind bear, and they lived in people's houses, and in grocery stores, and anywhere else they wished to live. They ate everything to be had in one place. They slept in beds and on couches, and then they moved on to the next place. Those two bears lived long lives. They never left each other as they moved from place to place. Now I will finish. Thank you. So again, many of you have heard me talk a lot today, but I'm happy to take a question or two if people have them. Yes?
You said you were going to talk just a little bit about how this became a book, and then you said this was also shown in galleries.
It's sort of, very humiliating process and fortuitous also. So one thing I said earlier today is I feel like if you're going to write, you can't always be thinking about the product. You have to be thinking about something that you want to work on or something. So I was trying to come up with a bunch, and I always am working on these secret projects. And then maybe 3 or 4 years ago, a writer I know, Andrea Barrett, contacted me and she said, "So are you applying for the Guggenheim Fellowship this year?" And I said, "No," because I'd applied before. Honestly, I think I'd applied 4 times maybe in 20 years. It's that kind of thing. And so the time I applied when I was working on my book, The Shelter Cycle, I felt like I had the sexiest proposal ever and the best people writing for me, and I thought, this is the time. And I didn't get it, so I thought, forget it, Guggenheim people. Like, you had your chance to shine on me, and it's over. But Andrea called me, and she said, well, why are you not applying? And I said, well, the reason I just told you. And I said, also, what the stuff I'm working on is so collaborative and strange, I couldn't even describe it. And she said, well, you know, the hardest thing about applying for this fellowship is finding 4 people to write you a letter. And we already wrote you letters. So you could just set aside an hour and a half and write a proposal, and we'll turn our letters in again. So I did that, and I thought it was just too strange and too unlikely. So I forgot about it kind of. And then I got the fellowship, and then it caused it to surface in a way so my publisher and my agent and everyone was like, what are you working on? Like, what is this? And so that happened, and then a gallery in Portland asked if they could put on a show, and then different people got involved. And if you go online, you can see all the pictures, but they also recorded all the stories. I'm not reading them. There's this great woman who reads them, and some of them even have soundtracks. But in the gallery, you could see the images, but you could also stream all of the stories as you stood in front of them. And then I thought that might be enough, but I really wanted there to be a book. But it took a lot of work and a lot of time. It's a really expensive book to make, but I didn't want it to be an expensive book to buy, and so that's sort of is hopefully what it will be. But I had to find people to give me money, even though like a publisher is publishing it. I still, with photography books, often I was just saying to Justin, photographers often have to pay the printing costs of things, and I just didn't. I'm so naive. I was like, what? No, the deal with publishing is people pay me, and then they never get the money back. That's always been the model. That's the model that I work on. I can still answer questions, but I'll put a couple of these little cards here, and the URL for that website are on there. Another hard question or two. Yeah?
What's the text going to look like? Like, is it going to be next to the photograph?
It's a big question of like how horizontal could it be, because I wanted the pictures to be as big as possible, and a lot of the pictures are not square. So it'll mostly, the photos will have their own pages. There's some weird things happening, but it's not too crazily designed. It's interesting because the 5 photographers, some of them are really sort of street photographers, and some of them are people who publish books and are much more uptight about how their work is reproduced. So trying to keep everyone happy is also part of that collaboration.
And it's hardcover?
No, somewhere between. It's kind of trying to get it in 1995. So,
That's the price point.
yeah, that's the price point. Yes?
Were you thinking of the project you described
Mm-hmm.
this afternoon?
Mm-hmm.
Were you thinking of that at any time when you were making this and responding to photographs in the way of plain spoken telling, like
Yeah, I guess so one thing I was talking about today was that, I think this is what you're referring to, that teaching writing classes all the time has kind of taken short stories away from me, and I wanted to figure out different ways to tell stories. I want to tell a different kind of story than the sort of story I'd written before. So as you can tell, these stories sort of are different shapes. They could be very folktale-like. They could be very prose poem-like. And so I guess maybe that's not the answer. So
I was thinking of the people you interviewed.
the people I interviewed
Utah.
in Utah, Montana, I think, certainly interviewing people and transcribing interviews and just using voices is something that I think all writers have their skills, or they're given skills. And my skill starting out was that I was always a pretty good ventriloquist. So the first novel I published in 1997, when I was 26 or 27, the narrator is a 75-year-old man. And it was because I worked on this ranch with the 75-year-old man who talked at me all the time. So a lot of it is just trying to pick up a cadence. But I think that's also been a way that I found a limit, which a voice can drive a story in a way. And if it's not my voice, that's kind of a hand to hold on to as I travel through the story. I get the feeling I'm still not answering your question. No? Yeah?
I noticed that some of the stories are very represented very literally in pictures and others are more associative. Could you talk about that distinction a little bit?
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of times when I read from this or when people see it, they assume that the pictures were chosen as kind of illustrations. And that's funny. And people are like, why would you choose this for this story? And I said, well, actually, the photos came first. Like, the photos always came first. And I think I was aware that sometimes there was a kind of literal story that I wanted to tell, and sometimes it was, I became much more drawn to more abstract images the deeper I got into the project. But I wanted to vary that too, that I kind of want, ideally, people to look at the photographs and have their own preconceptions and then see what happens in the stories. But I was aware of trying to vary the lengths and the voices and the sort of different levels of reality, I guess. But also that real sense of like some of them were going to be much easier correspondences and some, so it would be unpredictable, I guess. Yeah.
I love it. To me, it's like a book of writing prompts.
Yeah, and it's something that generated out of my museum guard days with my students. I often will I collect a lot of images and give them to them and say, you know, sometimes I give them other limits with the pictures, but it always works out pretty well. Yeah. All right, well, thank you all so much, and good luck.